In late 2013, one woman embarked on a grand new social experiment, unwittingly to be sure, but one which she had no prior knowledge of, I can assure you, and one that would later become a gold standard for the rules of engagement as we have come to know them on the internet. This woman, one Justine Sacco, a native of South Africa based in New York, and a senior director of corporate communications at a major company, was flying back to South Africa for the holidays to visit family. During the layover in London, she jokingly made a tweet for the ages, so to speak, a tweet to be unrivaled for its historical significance, that stated the following, quote, "Going to Africa, hope I don't get AIDS, just kidding, I'm white," end quote. As she flew from London to South Africa, she fell asleep, and upon landing was awakened to a new, hitherto unknown reality, as she was bombarded with messages, tweets, and the like, all admonishing her for her sin. She lost her job, her life as she knew it, and was forced to issue nonstop apologies for her statement. A joke, perhaps a very bad joke, but a joke nonetheless. She spent the subsequent year or so picking up the pieces of her life and keeping a low profile, but the impact of one of the first so-called Twitter shitstorms was immense and lasting. This all resulted from a poorly told, or perhaps better put, poorly tweeted joke on Twitter told, it should be noted by accident, with not a shred of malicious intent behind it. One can only imagine other cases, and indeed one need not only imagine, because there are ample examples these days of less than accidental tweets of far greater perfidy than the one Justine Sacco issued forth, that have earned lifetime condemnation and a lifetime impossibility of employment, social mobility, and anything one might view as a semblance of a future. Abide by the rules, and maybe, just maybe, you won't get shot down, but mistakes and accidents do happen, just as the one committed by Justine Sacco. And China has made headlines in recent years for all sorts of things. Investments and expeditions in Africa, crackdowns in Hong Kong, and the now effective dictator for life, Xi Jinping. But the one bit of news that seems to have people more worried than these other issues is the nascent Chinese social credit system, which is yet to be fully implemented. Part of this worry stems from its possible implementation and compatibility within Western societies, and part of it stems from the underlying fear that a soft dictatorship of the sort that the modern People's Republic can actually work on some level, much to the chagrin of democratic idealists and ideologues. The idea itself can be traced back to the times of Mao, and in essence is, with the emergence of modern technologies to support it, the perfect means of control of the citizenry. Behavioral standards are set forth by the government, and these are to be followed and obeyed. Compliance results in a better so-called social credit score. Social credit can be understood in practical terms as a number of things, particularly when applied to the negative. Reduction of internet speed, loss of internet access, flight and travel bans, loss of access to certain types of schooling, limited rent possibilities, reduction in employment opportunities, and just good old-fashioned blacklisting, which would essentially entail all of the above, and of course the reverse of that, which would imply receiving benefits for compliance. The genius, of course, behind all this is that the incentives offered make cooperation very likely, and the ratting out of dissidents equally likely, since doing so would increase the tattler's social credit and his benefits, thus reinforcing the system. Say your neighbor is expressing opinions that run counter to official policy. Recording him and selling him out will almost certainly boost your own standing. And given how common grift and corruption is in China, and the general lack of social trust, you better believe that the Chinese social credit system is tailor-made for that country's population. Now, as yet, the system has not been fully implemented, though the plan, based on sources one can read, is for the social credit system to be fully in place by 2020. One thing that is clear is that modern technology will be taken advantage of to varying degrees by people who seek to exert control over populations. But whether it is a government or a disparate group of organizations may not ultimately matter. Still, it would behoove us to examine the principal differences between what I refer to as the emergent, dispersed Western-style social credit system and the more formalized Chinese version. However, before proceeding, let us always remain aware of the fact that social credit, and we can define it in various ways, has always existed in one form or another. By this I mean that certain behavioral requirements that go beyond the conventional law-breaking and criminal penalties of the time have always existed. It's not something new, but something that goes back to probably the very beginnings of human communities, since this looser form of so-called social credit contributed to greater social cohesion, or at least the perception thereof. Social credit, though it can have financial implications in its modern sense and application, had just as many social consequences as there were financial in former times. Take, for example, a novel some of you might be familiar with, the 19th century novel The Scarlet Letter by Nathaniel Hawthorne. The tale begins in 17th century Boston, which was then a Puritan settlement. The young woman, the protagonist of the novel, Hester Prynne, is led from the town prison with her infant daughter named Pearl in her arms and the scarlet letter A on her breast. This, of course, stands for adultery. Someone in the crowd tells an elderly onlooker that Hester is being punished for adultery. Hester's husband, a scholar much older than she is, sent her ahead to America but never arrived in Boston. Most think that he has been lost at sea. While waiting for her husband, Hester has apparently had an affair as she has given birth to a child. She will not reveal the identity, however, and the scarlet letter, along with her public shaming, is her punishment for her sin and her secrecy. Now, I mention this novel because it illustrates well the social pressures and opprobrium that existed in the past. It was not a denial of credit per se from financial institutions, but ostracization, which one might mention can occur alongside the modern version of social credit. Deviation from communal social expectations resulted in real-world penalties, and of course, any community, and even today this would be largely true if one, for example, thinks about America's so-called Bible Belt, can apply these things. If you happen to be an irreligious person in a highly religious community, and the people notice you are not regularly going to church, or you make your irreligiosity known, you almost certainly will be received negatively, and perhaps even shunned. So in a sense, we've always had some kind of social regulation, which obviously has its parallels in social credit, though social credit does explicitly imply money and the flow of money. Nevertheless, the idea of conformity to certain behavioral expectations and values is nothing new, and one need only think about the possibilities that were lost to former totalitarian governments in, say, the early or mid-20th century. Case in point, I was recently in a conversation with a family friend who spent virtually his entire life in one of the former Soviet satellite states of Central Europe. I said to him, imagine the difference it would have made had the Soviet Union had access to this type of technology. It's a frightening thought, to be sure, but in actuality it was just a fortuitous circumstance of time and history that prevented the Soviet Union doing to itself and its satellites what is currently being done in China, or some equivalent. But as I have alluded to, the Chinese system is only one of several possible means of creating a social credit system. It is almost certainly the most direct form to date, and the benefits and drawbacks are clear and equally transparent in what the Chinese government is trying to achieve, which is a docile, compliant population that will live out its days in obedience in order to ensure its own prosperity. And of course, there's been much concern that this too will happen in the U.S., or the West more broadly. But I think it unlikely to take the form it's taken in China. In addition to the many economic problems that the Soviet Union had, its subjects and specifically its satellites were hardly content with the status quo. The Hungarian Revolution of 1956, as well as the Prague Uprising of 1968, amply attest to this. Whatever mechanism that allows the Chinese social credit system to work is as much a reflection of the people there as it is of the government. And for several reasons, historical, cultural, and possibly others, the Occident lacks the essential fabric to be as compliant and complacent as the Chinese, at least in that regard. We have a different history and evolution, yet we do, I would maintain, have a social credit system of our own. It is dispersed, decentralized, but it exists. Whereas the lure of the Chinese social credit system is to be found in largely monetary rewards and improved physical existence, the Western-style social credit system is voluntary. It is the YouTubes, the Twitters, the Instagrams, and people primarily participate because of the perception of improved social standing. Sometimes money might be associated with it, but that's not the primary object of desire. People go on Twitter, after all, to be part of what they probably instinctively perceive to be a community. And just as communities of old enforced rules of conduct, and people abided by them to remain socially acceptable within such communities, so too do they do the same on the internet. It might very well be that there's a new sort of hyper-awareness related to all manner of woke topics, but even without that, the notion of community and the strictures that bind such a community would be in place. and we would still need to deal with the repercussions of being globally interconnected. It just so happens that the politics of the day run in a certain direction that is not particularly tolerant of differing views, and there are, as with the example of Justine Sacco, real-world consequences that go beyond the Ethernet. Gone are the days of live and let live, if only because live and let live was possible and only possible when people live separately. And in some very real sense, we no longer do that. And in some very real way, the dispersed, unplanned, decentralized version of social credit that is becoming ever more important is somewhat scarier than the traditionally planned one in China, since one has clearly laid out rules of what is a no-go and what is not. Not so with regards to the Occident. Regardless of what ultimately might be preferable, there's no avoiding the fact that there will be an ever-growing entanglement between the real world and the internet, such that what is consequential to one will likely be consequential to the other. Moreover, the dispersed, opaque nature of the rules as they exist on the internet that are promulgated by the most powerful internet forces will make conformity, inasmuch as one even desires to conform to them, that much more difficult. The likelihood that it will not be governments in the Occident that pull the strings makes it in some ways all the more frightening, as diverse yet strangely similar powers that be constrict the airways of the internet even more than we could possibly imagine. It will be a new form of social credit, on a whole different scale and level, and we will all be sucked in, whether we like it or not. If you liked this video, please like, share, and subscribe. And if you enjoy my content, please consider making a donation or becoming a patron. Thanks for watching.